and gentlemen, welcome to something a little bit different, coming to you from a combination really of Geeks of Azeroth and Tauren and the Goblin. This is the Azeroth Book Club, and basically we're going to talk about Taliesin and Evertel videos for 90 minutes. No, as you probably guessed, it is a book club dedicated to all things World of Warcraft, and I'm really pleased that Nick and Katie have decided to join me today. And today we're going to be covering Richard A. Knaak's Dawn of the Aspects. But before we get involved in that, Nick, Katie, firstly, how are you guys doing? And do you want to perhaps give a very brief indication of what you thought about this book?
Katie, you can go first.
Yeah. You've been
right.
chosen.
I guess so. Well, Dawn of the Aspects, first of all, I'm doing great. Thank you for asking, because, I get to talk about Warcraft lore, and what do I love doing more than that? Absolutely nothing. So, I'm absolutely tickled that I get to talk about all the Warcraft books, because I've read them, and actually, I do like Dawn of the Aspects. It's an interesting book, because I think it jumps around a lot in where the plot is, but, I really thought it was interesting, because it's one of the few books that's actually told from the dragon's perspective, and that was a really unique perspective. It's told from a Proto-drake perspective, which you've never heard before, and you're like, wait, Proto-drakes are sentient? So I thought it was really cool. It was a little interesting to read at first, but then I don't know, we can get into some more of the details of it, but I really enjoyed it overall, and it's a really cool look into how the aspects were made. So it's just a neat book.
Great. Nick?
Well, I'm doing fine also, thank you for asking. And as far as the book goes, it's interesting because on the one hand, we chose this book because we kind of wanted to start from the very beginning of the history of Azeroth's lore. And this is sort of narratively, this tells the oldest story, going back to the rise of the aspects and the time of Galakrond. But it is very much a book of its time. It came out, I think it came out during Mista Pandaria. And so, while we're over, running around in Pandaria, this tells a little bit what was going on back up in Northrend, really, during that time. And we see a little bit of Jaina as the leader of the Kirin Tor. We see Kalecgos dealing with the fallout from Cataclysm. And so in that regard, it's that's an enjoyable time in the lore for me to go back to and revisit. So I'm glad we got to do that. And then also to go back to the very beginning and see that story. If I had one complaint, I kind of wish we had just seen more of the story, with the aspects. There's plenty of times where the narrative very conveniently cuts out and then it picks up a scene a little bit later. And you're like, oh, I kind of wish we had seen everything in between there, not just for like the obvious, like, oh, like there's one part in particular where somebody like details a plan, and of course, like just as they're about like, okay guys, so this is what we're gonna do, and then it cuts away like an old episode of Scooby-Doo or something.
Yeah. Not
just for that kind of stuff, but also for all the other, just to get a general feeling. I would have enjoyed a book that just focused on that, but it's an interesting way that they decided to tell this story, and I think it fits very well within the Warcraft narrative.
Yeah, and I would throw that in. I think it was really interesting to come back, I guess, from the perspective of Legion. As you say, this was written, or at least released, when Miss, it's got a little interesting bit at the back saying, oh, Miss is going on, and this is what Miss is all about. Join the game now. And coming back from a Legion perspective, where you've got, Kalecgos there, we're going into an expansion where Jaina plays quite heavily. The aspects obviously took a bit of a hit in Legion. And FYI, before I say anything, this is heavily massive spoilers. If you've come to this expecting a spoiler-free podcast, you're in trouble. So, yeah, definitely read this book. But yeah, I think coming from the perspective of Legion, at least, it's interesting to see, I guess more so for me, the mindset of where some of the aspects were. We get that little prologue at the beginning, which we'll get into in a moment, which I think set the scene quite well, because that doesn't necessarily come out in the story as much, and also showed a side to some of the aspects that I hadn't seen before, and it definitely coloured my opinion of some of them, so I'm sure we'll get into that, but heck, why wait, eh? So let's jump into the story. We'll start with the story. We're going to go into characters, themes, in time, and if you're in the Twitch chat, do throw out comments and whatnot, and we'll be sure to cover those. But in terms of story, Katie, Nick, you suggested perhaps doing a quick recap of some of the main points. I don't know how you want to do that. Katie might be best placed.
Sure, I'll try and make it kind of as bare bones as I can. But
the audio book in about 2 minutes, basically. That's what we're asking for.
All right, well, I will attempt to do so. So, essentially, the idea is, as we talked about, the first thing that we're introduced to is the aspects. So they're talking about Deathwing, and it kind of like flitters about a little bit how like their feelings on Deathwing and what's going on, and then it changes the scene to after Deathwing dies, and that's kind of where we first start to get into the real bits of the story here. And the story is told from Kalec's perspective, and for those of you who need a little bit of a refresher, Kalecgos is Malygos's, I believe it's his son, and he was chosen to be the aspect of magic, the blue dragon. And so he is new to being an aspect. He's new to having the powers when Deathwing comes to power, and he's been struggling with that for a long time. He's like, I don't really feel like an aspect. I don't feel part of the aspects because these are dragons of great power and magic and might, and I'm new to this whole idea. And after they defeat Deathwing, all of the aspects' magic and power gets taken away from them, and they kind of just become normal dragons, and they can no longer reproduce, and they're grappling with all these feelings of, where do I belong in this world anymore? We've been these bastions of great power and these protectors, but we no longer feel like we have a place and we don't know what to do. And so that's actually what the whole story is kind of based on, interestingly enough. But Kalecgos, like, after Deathwing is done, they have this meeting of the aspects, and the aspects all meet up, and they're like, we need to disband the Accord because we're no longer useful. And Kalecgos is like, what? We can't disband the Accord. And the other aspects kind of wave him off. They're like, you're young. You don't understand. You don't understand what we've been through. And he's like, this isn't right. Like, the world still needs us. We can't just disappear. And the other aspects are like, no, you're young. Like, we'll disband it properly in a month. And they all go their separate ways. And so Kalecgos is kind of heartbroken about this, and he goes back to the Nexus, and through a series of events, he gets called out to the bones of Galakrond. And Galakrond is this massive dragon out in Dragonblight. And actually, you can still go out and see the bones there today, which is kind of neat. But he finds an artifact in the bones of Galakrond, and essentially he starts getting pulled into all of these visions, and he gets attached to an old version of Malygos, which is kind of cool. So he's like seeing Malygos through Malygos's eyes as a Proto-drake, and he's starting to understand Malygos's thoughts and those kind of things. I don't know if maybe you want to jump in here, but
no, I think Nick, you got anything to add?
Well, I mean, yeah, so basically he's kind of inhabiting Malygos's body back in the days before Malygos was the aspect of magic that we know from the Nexus War. But this is back when everybody was young, and we encounter young Neltharion, young Alistraza, young Ysera, young Nozdormu, and there are no dragons. Everybody's just a Proto-drake, and they're all hanging out in I guess what becomes Northrend.
Yes.
This is back before anybody was really there to name anything, so it was, just the frozen wastes up in the north of Kalimdor. And they encounter Galakrond, and then through a series, I guess, as the visions progress, we see Galakrond become hostile and start attacking the dragons and eating the dragons, and then he starts growing in these weird growths, and he becomes a threat to the proto-dragons. And this is the story of how those five, who would become the aspects of, the aspects that we know, how they, team up together, they work with an unexpected ally, and wind up defeating Galakrond and saving the young world at that time. And as Kalecgos is watching these visions, reliving these visions as part of Malygos, he's also, he keeps kind of jumping back and forth between the past and the present, and he's trying to kind of extricate himself at first, and then eventually he kind of gives in. He's like, no, I need to see what's going on with these visions and kind of shut myself out from the world. And so at the time, this follows after Tides of War, when Jaina and Kalecgos kind of became a couple, and so Jaina keeps showing up to be like, Kalecgos, what's going on? And he keeps kind of pushing her away, and then she finally bursts in and she finds him in trouble. And so as he's going through these visions, we have her trying to save him from these visions himself, and then ultimately at the end, the visions resolve themselves and she's able to free him, and we see what happened there.
Well, and I also want to throw in at the very end of the story, which I think is even cooler, the artifact he found actually comes into two parts, and I don't know, this is the spoiler for the ending, so if you don't want to hear it, cover your ears for about a minute and a half. But what happens is they are able to purify the relic. This I just gotta call it the Titan relic. There we go. But
I don't think it ever has a name, does it?
I don't think it does. But
No,
he loses Tyr's hand, so I'm like, I wonder if it's like a Tyr's hand relic. Okay, so anyway. But they are able to purify the relic, and at the meeting of the aspects, Kalecgos actually brings it to them, and he doesn't ask their permission, but they're all got put into the relic, and Kalecgos has been going through all of these visions forcefully for about a month, but when he gives it to the aspects, they're able to relive it in the purified form in under 2 minutes. So they're able to relive all of their memories, and at the end it kind of wraps up where they're like, oh, I remember now what it was like to be a Proto-drake. I remember the struggle, and it changes their mind in some ways. Like, they decide not to dissolve their accord, but they're all kind of like, oh, well, it was dumb. They're kind of funny about it. They're like, oh, well, I guess not.
You can tell that they're all grateful to or Kalecgos for doing that, but they don't want to admit that they're grateful, and so they're still kind of, they're kind of brusque towards him, but they're still like, no, you did the right thing, even though you shouldn't have done the right thing. But
yeah. And Alexstrasza is much more kind in that regard. She's like, oh, Kalecgos, like it was you shouldn't have done this. You're like, okay, sure. She's like, but it was a kind gesture, and so in the end, it does have a good ending. The aspects kind of. I'm not really sure what they're going to do going forward, because, now that we've lost Ysera and stuff in-game currently, but it's nice to see that, okay, we're not going to just, shut ourselves out of the world. We're still going to try and get involved and be active instead of just all disappear, so... Because I don't... Go ahead.
Well, it's kind of a weird thing to think of, the world without the aspects, even though technically we've been in an aspectless world since Cataclysm, because... and this is one of the things that you kind of experience with World of Warcraft throughout the game, because even there's the one point where Malygos / Kalac meets Tyr, and you're like, I've heard of these keepers, but I've never actually seen one before. And I'm thinking, as a player, I think I've interacted with every keeper at some point. I go out drinking with them every Friday night. That's the kind of relationship we have with the keepers. And so to see and it's kind of the same way that Kalac regards Tyr is also similar to how he regards the aspects, where he's very referential to them. The kid who was talking about earlier, that when they're like, we need to just go away and never come back, he's like, no, you guys are super important. And so in that regard, these are all very crucial characters in the history of Azeroth from a power level perspective, and also from a historical perspective. And to see them all kind of interacting together, and also having the reverence for each other, or at least Kalac having reverence for everybody. I don't know. Malygos didn't know anything about Tyr, but to see that, and again, juxtaposing that against the player's experience, it's a little jarring. But yeah, it's definitely very insightful as far as how these sort of power players move through the world, and to think that we've created a bit of a vacuum that supposedly the Age of Mortals have filled, but are we doing a good job? Because it almost feels like the aspects should come back in a way. Not that they should sort of rule the world as they kind of were before, but we still need these powerful figures to kind of be there for us to reach out to when we get into trouble. When we're burning trees and
Alexstrasza,
and just
kind
of ruining the northern eastern kingdoms. We need these people to be like, hey, you guys need to behave, and then just kind of fix everything.
Yeah.
Definitely. And I think, it's interesting that we get to, for those who play through Cassie and played the final Deathwing raid, you get that end cinematic where it's very very mild, I guess. The glow from the aspects fades, and they, our time's come to an end. It's now time of the mortals, yada yada yada. And you think, brilliant, we're now in charge, and we're not in charge, but it's our responsibility to shoulder the future of Azeroth, and to come into this with the perspective into the mood that the aspects had, which is basically they lost their purpose. I guess this is fundamental, and the book ends very much with the aspects being given their powers because their purpose now is to protect Azeroth. So to start off with that what's the words, that stark contrast between what was a very awesome moment for us as players and what is clearly a very depressing and despondent moment for the aspects, I think was really interesting. I think one thing to note is obviously the way the story's told. So, as we were talking before the show, or perhaps in the early stream, the the way this is told is through those glimpses, and the basis in which the artifact works, or rather it's corrupted, means that it drags Kalecgos in and out of these memories almost out of his control. And we as readers, I was saying to Katie beforehand, as a reader, you were saying, Nick, actually, you'd get to a point where they're about to discuss a major plan with Galakrond, and the book is largely, Galakrond does something, they run away, and they try to plan the next attack or the next running away. But before they get something, suddenly the shift changes. And I thought that was really interesting because in the book, Kalecgos gets very frustrated that this story he's witnessing isn't making a lot of sense. He doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't know why people are doing things or what they're thinking. And as a reader, we're in exactly the same space. And I found myself getting really frustrated reading through this going, what's going on here? I don't know if this is either amazing connection with the protagonist or whether, the story's just falling apart in front of me and I don't know what's going on. So it was really a kind of weird experience. I think I'm glad for it because I think you build that connection to Kalecgos' perspective. But I guess at the same time, going back to what you were saying, Katie, some of the stuff we learn about the aspects and coming to that final scene where they're very grateful. I wondered if you guys wanted to talk. Sorry, Alessandro, I will try and eat the mic a bit. But I was wondering what you thought about the opening emotions of the aspects, without their role in the world. Like, how do you feel that was as a way to set the scene?
I actually thought it was a super relevant way because, as you mentioned, kind of the cutscene at the end of Cataclysm, right? You see the aspects like, oh, we are no longer like these mighty, powerful aspects. We had to sacrifice our powers to destroy Deathwing. And in the cutscene, they're like, now it's the age of mortals. But they're all kind of like very serene about it. But I mean, they're aspects, right? So we're like, oh, well, if you can be so graceful and serene, maybe it's not so bad. And then we get to see how they actually feel. They're like, what are we supposed to do now? Like, we've been these ancient guardians, and we almost never get to interact with the aspects that way because they're not very forthcoming with their emotions a lot of times. So I thought this was a really unique experience where we got to see like Norz Dormu being kind of frustrated. Like, I've never seen him frustrated in game. He's just like, oh yes, like I'm just Norz Dormu and I'm super chill and I go in and out of every time way and whatever. But he's like, like the Accord is stupid and I don't have any place here anymore. And, like, I'm kind of like, in his very Norz Dormu way, he's like, I'm done with this. Like, I don't know what to do. I've always had like a place in this world and now I don't, and I don't know what that means. And just getting to see their emotions even secondhand through Kalecgos was really neat, and it really made me sympathize for them because it's like, wow, I kind of really feel bad for them now. Like, I wish we could do more. Like, the mortals, I kind of wish the mortals would have been able to reach out and be like, hey guys, like you should come and like hang out with us more because you guys are great and we don't appreciate you enough. So
well, they basically got laid off from their factory job at an old age.
Yeah.
And they're too old to sort of retrain themselves for something else. This is the only thing they know how to do, and the factory's left town, so there's nothing, they can't get their powers back. So they're going through that a little bit later than a midlife crisis. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of similar to like when the Night Elves lose their immortality. But it's not quite as dire because the Night Elves didn't really have like any supernatural powers that they lost. I mean, these guys, it's not just, oh, hey, you lost your immortality. It's like you are the last bastion of defense for anything that's going to happen. And there's one particular event is going to happen that you guys need to stop. And yeah, you did that. Now what? So
they just lost their identities.
Yeah, Unfortunately, I guess there's no like goblin convertibles they can go buy and start like going out with like any like young proto-drakes all of a sudden on their arm. So
they could open a taxi company, maybe. I guess that's about it.
I want to see this.
But you're absolutely right though, Katie. That like it's the kind of thing where if they kind of express that sentiment towards other characters, like it's the kind of thing like, oh yeah, well we'll come hang out with us, like. Everybody's friends here. They really, and I think that's one of those things, like, because they're an aspect, their friend circle is so small. If they even have like a circle like that at all, like they don't really have an emotional support group that they can fall back on. If anything, it was each of themselves, and even then they're all kind of closed off, and because, they all seem to play politics with each other and everything, because that's what dragons do. So yeah, it's not the kind of thing like they should like go out every Friday night drinking, maybe with the keepers, but they're not, and they're just kind of stewing in their own juices, which isn't good.
Yeah, and I, if anything, I found them just to be, come across as assholes really at the beginning. Like when the way they were talking to Kalecgos, I just thought, why are you like this? It's particularly Ysera. She really has no patience for being there. And if anything, I found it odd that she was the most aggressive one at the opening. She saw no point, even when she came towards the end. She didn't see a point. She was asking, "What's the point? I hope you haven't wasted our time." Yada yada. And even at the end, after the vision, they're sitting there going, "Let's make sure this is something important next time." But if anything, it contrasted so well to what they were like as proto-drakes, because Ysera's, very stubborn. But at the same time, I don't, they make a lot of effort to point out that she's particularly weak, but that she's, she's stubborn, and she obviously plays a major role at the end in helping to defeat Galakrond. But in contrast, the other aspects didn't really. They were, Nozdumi was very quiet. Alistraza, though, was much more friendlier and nurturing, and I think if anything, it built that tension between the aspects that, they had very much distanced themselves from the family that they had built up in that combat. The way they were all splitting up, going their own ways. In fact, they weren't even waiting to say goodbye to each other at the towards the beginning when they left One Rest Temple. So, if anything, I think it built a nice contrast through that. So yeah, there's that. I'm trying to think of other aspects of the story. At the moment, my mind's going a bit blank. Is there anything in particular that stood out in your...
One thing I want to mention, you're talking about sort of how the aspects are, and one thing about Neltharion is that he's very...
Of course.
He's very straightforward in this, that, he's spoiling for a fight anytime that he can, the best way to solve any problem is just go right at it, and he'll, he's pretty confident in his abilities that he can take on anything, with the exception of Galakrond, and even then he still takes a few shots at Galakrond that he probably shouldn't have. But I thought it was funny because there's one part where he's like, I think early on when like Kalecgos has some rivals within, I guess, the other blue proto-drakes, and Neltharion's like, fight. And I happened to watch an episode of Muppet Babies, right, like after reading this sequence, and there was a part where Animal was on there. It was like, fight. And I'm like, oh, like Neltharion's like the animal of the group. Like he just kind of runs around with like a very manic energy and is just very physical and not very forward thinking in that regard. So I don't know. I guess the one thing that I thought was interesting too with regard to him is that the whole time, like anytime he does something like beneficial to the group or noble, that Kalecgos always is like, but this was Deathwing, like he struggles with the dichotomy there that like, oh, he's doing something good now, like, but he goes on to become something horrible, and then there's also the whole like baby Hitler thing, like if Kalecgos just killed him now, he would save the world so much pain later on, and it's like it doesn't quite work that way. But
if anything, I found Neltharion to be kind of one of the more likable characters because he was brash. He was he was just a more enjoyable character. He was always up for the fight. He just wasn't a pain in the backside for anyone. If someone was sporting for a fight, he was there, and that was basically him summed up. And he delved not delved in, that's the wrong word, but he mucked in with the family side of it as much as anybody else. He wasn't on the corner. You didn't in fact you didn't even see any tendencies for Deathwing. The only thing I picked up at the end was when they were giving their aspect powers, and there's a part where Kalecgos he turns around because Neltharion's the only one not paying attention, and he's looking to the mountains, and I wonder if he's looking to something like Yogg-Saron, or maybe that's an inclination that already he's taking on. He's hearing whispers from it because it mentions that as if he's listening to something. So I think that was probably the only glimpse of Deathwing we got. Of course, we got a glimpse of him in the prologue, which is I think there's a discussion there on what the prologue told us in comparison to the rest of the book. But
I think we should explain real quickly as far as the prologue itself was separate from the book originally. That the book was released in 5 parts. It was just online. It was just an ebook. It was released in 5 parts. I think like $2 each part. And then the prologue itself was released as a short story on the website. And then when they published the book, they put the prologue, the short story in as the prologue. And so it all fits together in one nice package. But the prologue itself is independent from the other story.
I actually didn't know that. That's good to know.
No, I didn't know either. To be honest, I should have looked at it. I know it was broken down into different sagas, but I mean, having that as a singular book though, so you have that scene with expansion, the prologue is set during the Cataclysm event itself. Deathwing is planning his evil plans. He's being, Dick Dastardly, all that sort of stuff. And basically the story is that Thrall, who is kind of taking on the aspects of the Earth role, kind of starts to hone his powers on Mount Hyjal, and he comes into confrontation with Deathwing, and almost gets his butt kicked. So, and they manage to use the World Tree to effectively save him. And I think, that was interesting because you got a glimpse as to what was to come. Interesting in so much that the book came out during Pandaria, so, it's looking at the past still. But something that stood out for me is, the idea that for Deathwing, he felt that Thrall was taking his responsibility from him, and he did call it a curse, but he felt it was something his to own, which is the complete opposite to what Kalecgos felt, for example, which was that it wasn't his responsibility; it was something that he had fallen into. So again, you're seeing these different perspectives on what those aspects, as you were saying earlier, these aspect duties, where some of them feel that they're bound to it because no one else can take it, which is kind of the scene that gets set at the end. Whereas Kalecgos, and through all of Kalecgos' story, feels that he's always having to live up to something that he never should have had. It should have always been Malygos or someone else, maybe. And I guess looking to the other side of it, so that Kalecgos route, what was your perspective on that? What did you think about? It feels like a side story. It's not a side story. It's a huge part of the book. But what did you feel we gleaned about Kalecgos from it?
You mean the Kalecgos in the present day?
In the present, moping around on the floor most of the time.
Well, there, I think there he served a few purposes. I think one, to sort of figure out what this relic was. I mean, that's one of the big mysteries of the book as you go through it, is why is the relic doing this? And what exactly is happening? And then the other two there is I think that justifies the setup, because really in a way I almost feel like Kalecgos in the future wasn't too critical to the book. Like, they had to have that happen because, like, it's narratively sort of one of the through lines there and what's happening with him. But ultimately, it's like you get the setup at the beginning, like with the aspects, they're kind of fractured. Then you have Kalecgos goes back in time, and we see how the aspects come together. And then at the end, he's able to show them, like, hey, this is what I just went through. This is what you guys went through. Like, now we're all on the same page. Everybody worked together again. And I mean, you get some interesting stuff. There's the Tonka Bunique, who shows up with him, and then also with Jaina, and it's kind of established that she's not what she appears, but it's never really explained who or what she is. And then you also get some stuff again with Jaina sort of ignoring her responsibilities with the Kirin Tor to focus on Kalecgos and kind of help him. And you get a little bit more with their relationship that was established in Tides of War, as I mentioned. So, I mean, you get kind of all it fits, it slots in like where it's supposed to slot in as far as the story goes. But ultimately, I think to the story they're telling in the book, the most important through line is, like, if you look at the aspects, it's, what happened, like their creation, and then it's used to kind of bring them back together at the end.
Katie, anything to add there?
I just wanted to talk briefly. I think this actually shows us a lot about Kalecgos, kind of how he's grown and changed, because the first place I think we encounter Kalecgos is before he's an aspect, and I think it's the Well of Eternity, where he's going after Athena, the Sunwell avatar, I guess is appropriate to call her. But after that, he kind of comes back in Cataclysm a little bit. I don't think we see him much in the in-between. But then, between, him becoming an aspect after we defeat Malygos, like that whole bit, he kind of grows and changes. And, again, as we kind of said, he's kind of not sure what to do with the aspect power when he has it, and then he doesn't have it anymore. And then, he just goes through a lot of ups and downs. And I think it's actually important to note that the blue dragons are going through a lot of change in his sanctum right now. They're actually, when he returned, he's like, blue dragons, you can do whatever you want. And most of them choose to leave the Nexus. So he mostly is walking around in the Nexus by himself, and he doesn't feel like a good leader. He has a lot of emotions playing around when he sets the scene for this book. So it's been fun to kind of watch him go through like understanding what the aspects are and what their charges were initially. And I think actually it'll help him come into his leadership of being the dragon aspect of the blues, if nothing in title, but it'll help him kind of bring the blues back together, because right now I think it is in Azeroth they're all kind of scattered to the winds, and I know he very much wants them to come back together as a family, as an aspect, and so hopefully there will be more story about that. But I think this entire experience has helped him kind of figure out what he wants a little bit too, I hope. So it was neat to have it from his perspective.
Yeah, and I definitely liked the situation he was facing at the beginning. So, he'd done his part, and probably like all the other the aspects, he felt that, well, not only that his responsibilities had faded, he was still trying to cling to his responsibilities. He felt very much still in charge of the Nexus, or not in charge, responsible for the Nexus and all the secrets it contained. But the way that he saw his dragonflight disintegrate, I think, was really interesting. I know they couldn't have told it necessarily from another perspective, but I do wonder what the other aspects would have felt. How they would have perceived their dragonflights. Do they still see them as close-knit communities, or would they have seen them more as, you're free to do what you want, which is what the blue dragonflight was going through. And I'm not familiar whether they get brought together later in later books or in the game necessarily.
I think so.
I don't.
I wonder how much of that though too is like on him, his like inferiority complex, because we established like he looks up to the other three aspects, and I think he's probably thinking in like his head like, well, if Malygos was still here and he was still in charge, he wouldn't have let these guys fall apart. He would have known what to do. But I'm completely overwhelmed by this. I just got this power. Now I've lost it. And now everybody's looking at me like, what are we going to do? Like, I'm just the same guy I was like 2 years ago now. And everybody expects me to have the answers. I don't have the answers. And it's really kind of traumatic for him.
Mm-hmm. And I actually believe he does have some of those feelings, like, it's kind of like sprinkled on top in the book, but you do definitely get that sense that he's grappling with the Nexus and the disintegration of basically his family. Like, there's a couple points in which he encounters other dragons that are blues, and they come in, and one of them's like, hey, I need to talk to you. And he's like, oh, okay. And it's like, well, I'm going to leave the Nexus. And he's like, okay, no, that's fine. And he's like, it's not fine. Like, I feel really bad for him, though, because, like, a lot of the blue dragons have now left their ancestral home, and they're just kind of scattered to the winds. And I don't... Actually, it's interesting, because I know that we visit the Nexus in Legion for a couple of the artifacts, I think, but I never got the sense that there were more blue drakes back, so hopefully they'll... I want there to be, like, even a small character arc that addresses some of the dragon families and what they're going through. Because especially after reading this book, like, you're like, oh, there's some, like, family problems going on here. Like, maybe as adventurers we can help, like, make the dragons feel a little more relevant, because they're very important in Azeroth. At least they are to me, so.
Well, there's the handful of blue dragons down in Azuna.
Yes. It was cool to see that. I guess
that's, like, the last of their breeding grounds, pretty much, and they're struggling with the Night Fallen coming and attacking their young. And Knaak shows up there for a little bit, but he's pretty much, at least in Legion, as far as that goes, he's taken up Jaina's spot on the Council of Six.
Yep. Which is kind of
actually, no, because Khadgar took Jaina's spot. Yeah, so Knaak had his own spot on the Council of Six, rather, yes. But yeah, he's there. He doesn't, outside of giving you, I think, some of the quests related to the blue dragonflight, I don't think he does too much.
Well, he does help you with empower your artifact, which was kind of cool.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that little thing he does. You go collect a bunch of stuff. You're like, dang it, Kalecgos.
Yeah, and I'm looking back. I know for the Arcane Mage artifact, you go to the Nexus. I cannot remember how that goes. I get the feeling it is just filled with random mobs that aren't necessarily the Dragonflight.
I literally just did this the other week. It's ethereals are there.
Yes,
they're there trying to siphon the energy into the void. And so you show up, you actually go, I think you actually go around the bones of Galakrond. It starts off, and you follow like a trail back to the Nexus, and then you have to get into the vaults, which they kind of reference. He's got that he keeps saying like, oh, I got to go through the vaults and sort out all these artifacts that we got in there. And so it doesn't directly reference a Lunith, but it's kind of implied like a Lunith would have been one of these artifacts. He's got to go sort out in the vault, because the vaults, I guess, are a mess. When you've lost all your power, what else are you going to do but clean out your closets? So
yep.
I just imagine giant piles of incredibly powerful weapons like a Lunith just scattered about. You're like, oh yeah, he's just like, here's a legendary staff, another legendary staff, legendary eye of something. So
it's like Jaina's rocking up to his place, and he's like, "Don't come in. I'm not prepared.
I'm not ready."
It's like I wasn't expecting my girlfriend to show up. Yeah, and obviously, as you said, Nick, we get the a building of the relationship between Kalecgos and Jaina, which is not necessarily subtle. There is clear romance. So there's that, and I do get a sense that, yeah, how can I put it? I think they underplayed that a little bit. I felt like Jaina's role was obviously pivotal to unlocking some of the secrets, but at the same time, I feel like Jaina wasn't quite 100% what I would expect her to be. Given all the turmoil she was experiencing, she had they talk about the Kirin Tor and how it's demanding her attention, but as someone who had obviously faced the destruction of Theramore and all that stuff, I do wonder if maybe her mindset perhaps wasn't as explored as it could have been.
Although at this point, I don't think Theramore has been destroyed, because this is pre-Pandaria. Was it?
No, that all happens post that, because it actually talks about, she actually references Theramore's destruction in there, and she's already in charge of the Kirin Tor, which happens when Ronan dies in the destruction of Theramore.
I thought this came out in Pandaria, but it's referencing Theramore, so yeah.
Yeah, it's true. So it's kind of a weird... as I said, like the main character plotline jumps around a little bit, so you're never exactly sure where you are. You're like, because like a couple months pass, and you're like, where are we? There's only like a 2-year period that this could be, so before the next disaster.
Exactly, before the next one comes around the corner. And I guess, we probably should move on to Galakrond.
Oh, yes.
Because, he plays a bit of a part in this.
Just minor. Just my footnote.
Minor character. And as someone who, a character that was there very much in Wrath of the Lich King, although not necessarily explored. You have quest lines around him, but, he's dead. So, you haven't really had a chance to explore what he was like or how powerful he truly was. How did you both feel Galakrond's portrayal was in this book?
Nick?
I don't know. We talked a little bit about this in the pre-show, that he starts out massive and he doubles in size every time that you see him. So yeah. It's really kind of hard to get a grasp how big he actually was at any given point, because even in the book, one of the first things Kalecg does is he goes to Galakrond's bones, and they describe the bones with the skull sticking out and the jaw broken off, and it's actually really impressive that that's this, they explain that, that the way he dies and the jaw falls off and everything at the end of the book, when that happens. So they set that up very well. They have that mirror itself. But you go and you look at the bones in game, and you don't even really see most of his skull. It's kind of partially buried. So that was a little bit disappointing in that regard, but he's just so massive, and it's hard to get any good sense of scale on him. There's the one part where he actually fights Tyr, and it starts off the fight where I think Tyr comes up to his shoulder, and I'm imagining something out of Pacific Rim there, where you've got a kaiju battle that is these two massive forces clashing throughout Northrend, but he grows after that. He actually defeats Tyr more or less because he bites his hand off, which I thought was a nice little setup to the lore of Tyr and whatnot. Yeah. But that also that was something that kind of made sense, because when Kalecg finds the artifact in the bones of Galakrond, I'm thinking, well, Galakrond has to eat this at some point, doesn't he? That would make a lot of sense that he ingests it, and that's why it's in the middle of his rib cage, which is what winds up happening. So yeah, it's. I guess the other thing that's fascinating that they don't explain is that he goes through these metamorphoses, and they say that it's kind of due to him eating the other proto-dragons, that he's absorbing their life essence, and that's allowing him to morph. But it also feels very old goddy, with the eyeballs all over him. Yep. That
eyeballs, mouths and distended little legs and stuff. Ugh, yuck.
And the various legs and protrusions, it's very old goddy. And I'm almost wondering if this wasn't not necessarily an early version, but something related to the Curse of the Flesh, although he's already technically flesh, so could that, I don't think that would necessarily apply to him, but I was looking up what exactly are the Proto-drakes, because they descended from the elementals, but they turned flesh themselves, so you can't, don't think you can apply the curse of the flesh to something that's already flesh. So I don't know exactly what the old gods were doing, and they don't really explain it. But he's very just. He's almost. It's interesting because it's happening in Northrend. He's very like pre-Lich King.
Yeah.
I mean, he's got this army of undead dragons that he's amassing that he can control, just like Arthas can control the Scourge. And so I guess there's a very like implied connection between him and Yogg-Saron without really getting into any of that. It's just something you kind of have to read into.
Actually, I'm going to read this out because before, you're absolutely right, Nick. Like, there was a lot of speculation, but I think actually in Legion, we got a little bit of flavor text from Xal'atath, which is the priest weapon, the priest knife weapon, which everyone loves because it's like, the best thing for little dabbles of secrets. But Xal'atath actually whispers to your priest, "A powerful dragon can be a powerful tool. Alas, gone are the days of Galakrond." So that seems to cement to me that the old gods indeed had corrupted Galakrond. And actually, I wouldn't be surprised in some ways if Galakrond was kind of like a first test to see how well dragons can be corrupted. Because then think about Neltharion and Malygos that eventually went insane as well. So, I mean, Deathwing was actually corrupted by the old gods. I think Malygos went insane due to some whispers, but then he also kind of turned against the mortals and did most of that himself. But I thought that was an interesting connection. Definitely, like, there's one point in the book that really struck me when the Aspects are fighting Galakrond, and they go to attack him, and one of them gets whipped by a tail, and they turn around and look at the tail. It's the tail is filled with eyes, and all the eyes are looking at them. I was like, oh, like, that's just so visual, and it gave me the heebie-jeebies. But yeah, no, it definitely feels very old goddish in a couple of ways, because Galakrond first starts out by eating creatures, and what we find out is he's eating a ton and he's growing, and then he starts eating proto-drakes, and that becomes very scary. And then we start encountering these undead proto-drakes. The heroes do, and they're not sure where they come from, and eventually they find out that when Galakrond eats them, he hacks them back up as undead proto-drakes. And then even later in the story, he starts eating the undead proto-drakes and absorbing their undead essence, and it just like becomes this whole nightmarish scene of Galakrond not being able to feed enough, so he starts to absorb all these different essences and starts to almost fall apart in this really disgusting way. So it's very, I'd say it's very visual, and you're like, ooh, like, ew, he's this giant undead behemoth, essentially. But go ahead.
Well, I know in the pre-show, Britzza, you were asking about, like, there's parts where he starts coughing, and some of the appendages, like, shrink back, and he starts to actually almost revert in a way. And I wonder, I think it's that it almost seems like he was absorbing so much power, he was unstable.
Yes.
And the coughing seemed like it was stabilizing him a little bit more. And the mutations that they talk about, not just these appendages in the eyes and everything, but they specifically talk about how he morphs from a proto-drake into, like, the shape of an actual dragon. Like, his head sleeks out a little bit, his forearms grow massive. I mean, that's what helps him get an edge on Tyr, is that Tyr's not basically expecting him to be able to punch him, and he kind of punches Tyr with his forearm because his forearms grew massive. So he didn't skip arm day. But it's I think what would have happened is that if the Aspects hadn't killed him and he, I guess, I think he would have stabilized eventually, and I think that stable form would have been him becoming the first dragon. That eventually he would have coughed enough to shake off all those appendages and protuberances, and he would have become just this massive dragon that would have just dominated the planet. And at that point, you have to wonder, like, would he have started? The only thing that he could feed on would be, like, the essence of Azeroth itself. And so you can kind of see how Tyr at least understood, like, this thing, like, is going to spark, it marks the end of the world if we don't do something about it. We've let this thing go on too long. And that's actually another point to compare. We talked earlier about, like, the Aspects kind of giving up on their role and kind of walking away. That's exactly what the Keepers did. That they were in their own spot of, we just dealt with the Black Empire and all everything there, and the Titans we don't know what's going on with them. Or actually, I guess at this point they knew the Titans were dead. They had absorbed their essences, didn't they? And they were all kind of in their malaise, I think.
Yeah, which is where the lore gets complicated, because at the time they were dead, but now we know they're not dead.
Not dead, so they're like kind of pseudo dead.
There's one line in the prologue where somebody even says, like, the Titans could be dead for all we know, and I'm like, I don't think they knew that was going to be as prophetic as it was. But Yeah, but so I think that helps explain why Tyr had the artifact and was using that, because he was like, if the aspects ever get into the same malaise that we're in now, I want to make sure that there's a way that they can get out of it, because we shouldn't have gotten into this malaise, because this led to Galakrond, and if they kind of like walk their own separate ways and don't care anymore, then who knows what's going to come at that point. So they need to stay on point too. So I think that, again, that's kind of like, I might be reading it a little bit there, but I think that explains some of Tyr's actions that we don't really see, because he's very mysterious throughout the book too.
Mm-hmm. He is, and it always seems, especially with the role the artifact plays, that he's factored in everything to his plan, which is surprising given how beaten up he really gets. But nevertheless, it seems to have planned out perfectly for him, especially with the artifact playing a pivotal role in bringing the aspects together at the end. But something with Galakrond that stood out with me, going back to what he actually is afflicted by, because there's a point in the book, I don't know whereabouts it is, but they talk about what Galakrond was kind of like before he became like he was, and how he was actually quite benevolent. And in a way, I felt it would be nice to have seen a little bit of that, just to get a sense, because apart from that, he's very much like Smaug. I can imagine almost Benedict Cumberbatch doing a voice line in my head, but the way he talks, and he's relatively sane. He's not like a mindless dragon in any sense, but the affliction is what confused me a bit, because whilst this is all going on, there's the issue which affects Malygos, which is that he gets bitten by one of the undead Proto-drakes, which instills a hunger for, I don't know if it's just Proto-dragon flesh, but it certainly makes them want to eat each other, which is something they haven't ever thought of before. And I wasn't sure, what, in a sense, what came first, in that sense. Did Galakrond just develop this hunger, and it's that hunger that just spiraled out of control, or was there some other play in there? And so trying to figure that out was a little bit difficult, but as you say, I think the general sense that Richard A. Knaak was trying to portray was that he was almost like a proto-Lich King, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, and this is the dragon equivalent of that, whilst at the same time the dragon, and particularly Malygos, was having to confront this hunger, which I don't think ever got cured. I don't know.
No. Well, not so much in Galakrond, but for Malygos, yes, because at one point, and I'm not quite sure, I don't remember in the passage, because Ysera, he starts to go crazy when he's in the cavern with Ysera and Tyr.
Oh, of course, yeah.
And Ysera kind of talks him down, and then I'm not sure if Ysera actually cures him, or if, because that's also when Tyr holds out the artifact and flashes a white light at him. And I'm not sure if that cures him. I think Ysera actually cures him.
I thought it was the artifact that cured him, or like the artifact removed or suppressed the. At least that's kind of what I remembered, is that like the artifact suppressed the hungering urge, because Tyr's like, I'm surprised you've survived this long with that kind of hungering, and Malygos is like, I guess. Like, he's kind of still like in and out of it a little bit. But I'm not sure if he gets cured so much as that it's like suppressed or something to that effect, but we're also going...
It's suppressed enough that it's not an issue for the rest of the book. So.
Yeah. But it's also an interesting thought, because I had a thought when he was bitten. It was like, I would wonder if this weakens him to insanity. Because, I mean, Malygos goes insane in Wrath. And I was like, it's odd that they make a big point of him being bitten. And then it's never really, like, it's brought up so much as, like, he has urges to eat other Proto-drakes at a couple points, and then he doesn't, and then it just kind of, like, after it gets cured or suppressed, is never brought up again. I was like, that's an interesting to add, like, in the book overall, and that might have just been for us to sympathize with some of the dragons, like, what they were feeling, and when they got bitten, and how it perpetuated the undeath, sort of like the weird, eating of other Proto-drakes, because they do describe that Proto-drakes find that incredibly wrong. Like, you should not eat other Proto-drakes, no matter if you're starving or not. That's against any sort of like code they have. Even they call them unsmart drakes, so there are the smart drakes, like not smart drakes and smart drakes. Even the unsmart drakes, the ones that don't talk or think in the way that the aspects do, and some of the other drakes, like the aspects weren't necessarily unique in this matter. There were other ones that thought and could talk and that sort of thing. Even the not smart proto-drakes would not eat other proto-drakes. So that was like a code of being a proto-drake, is you don't eat other ones. And this horribly disturbed all of the other proto-drakes that Galakrond started eating them. And then even Malygos's rival, whose name was Koros, started eating other proto-drakes and started to go insane. And he was dealt with later, but it's just interesting to watch that kind of devolve in their like beginnings of dragon society.
Yeah, Koros got definitely what he was. In a way, I was surprised how quickly Koros was dispatched. I was expecting maybe that setup for an ambush to play out, because it was interesting to see. Yeah, the Koros was killed. Malygos warned them, but Galakrond had factored that in, so he surprised and ambushed them. And in a sense, it kind of Koros just kind of disappeared, and it wasn't irrelevant, but it was he played his part.
Yeah.
So any other particular aspects of the story that we've missed so far? I feel like we covered a wide area, and I'm trying to think of the gaps that we might have missed. Was there anything that stood out to either of you?
What was the description of Tyr having his mustache go down to his chest?
Oh, it's like beard or something? Like he had a long beard or something.
How long was his facial hair? That I have to go and look at my pictures of Tyr again, because I don't
think it was
a long
that
mustache.
Yeah.
I do. It was, like,
is he like? I'm trying to imagine him looking like some kind of like crazy version of Hulk Hogan now, with like a silver hair.
with all the old wrestling motifs as well.
Yeah, that's kind of odd, because like his in-game model, I don't think, or whatever. Like I didn't think that his artwork had it going like all the way down Hulk Hogan. You know what I'm trying to say, but I didn't. I thought it was just more of like a small facial mustache.
We're getting into the deep and meaningful aspects of the story now.
Very deep.
But that does mean something, which is we are seeing the keepers.
That's true.
And for what they're worth, they are secretive. You don't learn a lot about them. Even the other two, I don't know if we're able to guess the identities of the two that appear and effectively abduct Tyr when he's wounded by that lake. But at the end, I got a sense that the keeper. I mean, what? Before I go any further, where are the keepers in the lore now? What are they still around, or?
I
You
think
talk Katie about how they should perhaps hang out maybe with the aspects now they both retired.
they should all go out for beers more often.
Yeah.
Gosh, I'm trying to think, because I think after Ulduar and parts of Pandaria, like we've come across some more keepers, or like keeper. I don't know if I should call them keeper assistants, but I'm not sure actually where a lot of the keepers are right now. Nick, do you remember? Like,
I think most of them are still up in Northrend, hanging out around Ulduar. I mean, Mimiron is still there. You go and you interact with him. Well, I think Loken's dead.
Oh yeah, Loken's dead. Sorry.
The ones that aren't dead, they're either dead or I think they're up in Northrend, except for like Odin, who's up in the Halls of Valor. So they're still around. They're still. I get the feeling like the ones that are still around are kind of going to be a pain for us. There's something we kind of have to deal with. Like they've got a little off the reservation. Freya, as Ali Slaughter mentions, Freya's in Shalazar, or at least, she was, because that was where she was fighting the Scourge incursion into Shalazar. They were coming over the one hill, and she was there trying to stop.
Nodin was obviously locked away, and
now he's not. Oh, he's free now. Mm-hmm. So that's something I think we're going to have to deal with, because he was a big part of Legion.
Because that's the impression I got at the end of the book, and I've forgotten the name of the character that's in the bones.
Bunique,
that's it. I got the impression Bunique was Tyr.
Yeah,
but Tyr's been dead for
I don't know.
Yeah, because he dies. He dies fighting the Cathraxi, and that's why Tyr's Fall is called Tyr's Fall, because that's
right.
Tyr's Fall, and then.
Although
I got the impression, they must be maybe it's some sort of like digital imprint
Yeah,
from the item or something.
that's
You
the
never
thing.
know.
Yeah, it could be like something from the artifact unlocked some aspect of Tyr that he was able to appear. Like, yeah, that the Bunique is never explained what exactly she is, and they just kind of, it's either a keeper or, because even then, like after Tyr is defeated, not dead, but Galakrond bites his hand off, which I thought was cool because that sets him up getting the silver hand, which would go on to inspire the paladins as the Knights of the Silver Hand. So Galakrond bites his hand off, and then you get the two other keepers, and I think it was Freya, and they didn't say who the other keeper was. I don't think they mentioned, but they said there was one male, one female, and so the female would be Freya. And they just kind of like give little messages to Kalecgos, like do this, do that, just to make sure that he's able to counter Galakrond properly. But they don't really reveal themselves until the very end. And then that's when, like, as Kalecgos finally, like, fades out, like, that's when they're like, okay, now we're going to give everybody your powers, and here's what you're going to see. And they don't really, like, even then because that's one of those things, I think, at the time, you're like, wait a minute, like, they talk about Aman'Thul charging, like, Nozdormu, and all the different actual titans giving the aspects their powers. And here you see the keepers are like, okay, like, we're going to give you guys your powers now. And I don't know if it was until Chronicle that they kind of made sense, like, oh, like they channeled the titans to do that. So they did kind of talk to the titans, but they also kind of didn't, because they were just kind of being channeled. So
yeah, and I think there's a reference when they're doing that they grow in size, and then I think it's a reference to the Titans. Or Kalecgos gets the impression they're channeling. But again, I guess that's kind of the way the book's been written, is that it's very much told from, I say Kalecgos' perspective, Kalecgos' perspective as the observer. And as a result, you get these huge gaps. And I do wonder if, in a sense, Blizzard said to Richard Knaak whether, listen, we're still fleshing out some of the lore, so maybe you shouldn't talk too much about these things until we figured out what's going on. And I wonder how difficult a challenge that was for him to write, because as you say, they start to get into the juicy bits of getting the aspect powers, and then he goes, and even Kalecgos is like, oh, I'm done with this, I'm so done with this. He just gets beamed out into Jaina's arms. So there's that.
Well, I thought it would have been cool if there was like one scene at the end, like the five of you, and then like one of the Titan aspects or somebody just gives a good look at Kalecgos, like, or six of you, like, to indicate like he knew Kalac was in there all along. Like, that would have been a nice little thing, but they didn't do that.
Also, well, hold on. Before we change that, did any of you catch that when Jaina touched the artifact, she got pulled into Alexstrasza? Like, that was a really interesting, like, I don't know, like, I guess I wonder if you had 5 random people, would they get pulled into the 5 random aspects at random, or do you, like, get pulled into the person that's most similarly attuned to you, or... I just thought that was interesting. It's a footnote.
And when Kalecgos is trying to get out of the vision for the last time, he sees Alexstrasza, but Jaina's eyes. And again, that's that interesting thing. How much control do they have in that moment? I know it's a projection of time, but there's always these illusions that Kalecgos might have some control, or that he thinks something and suddenly Kalecgos reacts to it, or something like that. And you do wonder if is there a bit of Warlords of Draenor timey-wimey stuff maybe happening? I imagine not, but there might be a 5% chance that they are somehow. Because when it got to, there was a point in the book where it got to a point where Kalecgos was like, he couldn't imagine anything else than being just a part of Kalecgos. And I did wonder, are they trying to get to an idea that, there's an alternate Kalac, or maybe there was a Kalac always in, and it's kind of like a time loop system, but no, they never went there.
I think they were just trying to set the stakes, because they had talked about, I think it was Rulfo, who was the mage that Jaina found in her research, who had encountered the artifact before, and then he kind of went crazy with these visions, and then he, after like 3 or 4 days, he died. And I think it's the kind of thing where it would make sense that for a mortal, given how the artifact was corrupted, like, I mean, Kalac, at the end of it, he was turning into a proto-dragon. And at least he is a shapeshifter, that he kind of has the ability to do that. I would assume a normal human starting to turn into a shape-dragon, turn into a proto-dragon, that's just going to tear them apart. So, I mean, as we find at the end, that this was always intended for the aspects anyway, but that as much as the artifact was corrupt, that Kalac was one of the few people on the planet, being the blue, former aspect of magic, who could, handle that properly. yeah, I think his concern all along, if Jaina gets sucked into this, she's not going to be able to handle it. I think he's right that, and I mean, it would have been a completely different story if Jaina was dealing with that. But I think the shape changing, I mean, where he'd wake up in different spots, either as the blue dragon, either as in his half elven form, or the one part where he's got the dragon claw clawing the floor of the Nexus. I don't think Jaina would have been able to handle that. And that, you just imagine like Jaina like just bloodying her fingers, just clawing, like that gets gritty.
It does.
And in those scenes, though, you get the illusions that I think one point he finds a cloaked figure in the hallway and he chases after him. And there's other scenes Jaina sees the cloaked figure, and I who's that? Because I mean, it must be a keeper, presumably.
I think it's probably a vision of Tyr, because like if you remember when Kalecgos would see like the undead proto-drakes, and like what they'll lunge at him, and then he'd suddenly be pulled back into a vision where they'd be more real. Part of me thinks that maybe similar to Beneath, they're like shadows or parts of the artifact or the relic. Like, because Jaina didn't start seeing the shadowy figure until she started interacting with the relic, at least from what I understand. And so I would, that's how I interpreted it, that the shadowy figure, because the cloaked figure in the book, once Kalecgos is in the vision, reveals himself to be Tyr. So it might just be like Tyr checking in on Kalecgos, or like, I don't know how that would work, because it's a Titan Titan artifact. I tried to say relic and artifact at the same time, and that did not go well. But it's a Titan relic / artifact, and I know that there's a lot of ambiguity with those anyways. So I guess it could be just a projection of him. It could actually be a keeper checking in on them, but I mean, because they're in Northrend, so that wouldn't be as big of a stretch, but it seems a little unlikely with how distant they've become in the lore. But I don't know. It's like the whole thing where Bunique was probably a keeper anyway. You're like, maybe they're like, there's something weird going on with this artifact, but we don't really want to interfere. They'll figure it out. It's tainted. We don't want to get close to it. So...
And yet vastly powerful enough to control the wards of the Nexus.
And
I've not found hard to believe, but it was like, you know, it had been in Galakrond, I guess, for a long time, but the power that the artifact had, the fact that it was effectively autonomous, it was controlling the wards of the Nexus, it was beating up Kalecgos and then having a go at Jaina, and, you know, there was nothing they could do to destroy it. There's that scene where Kalecgos just goes nuts and tries to effectively blow it up. And yeah, it's you know, it's an interesting tool, I guess, for a Titan to use, as opposed to, you know, like what we encounter as players normally, which we have to go into a temple and we get the whole knowledge of the universe beamed into a nice projection for us, and we just sit there for 5 minutes and download the cinematic, which is basically what the Aspects got. I guess they got the full Titan player experience.
Now, one question I had, speaking of temples, is we know that Galakrond dies near the Wormrest Temple. Mm-hmm. But that's never referenced as being there in the book, that, at least in the olden times, like, at no point does Kalecgos flying around what would become Northrend see that temple that anybody wonders what it is. But we know that temple's been there for like forever. Mm-hmm. So this was presumably then built after this?
Actually, I want to jump in here because I have a thought. Because it's called Dragon's Rest because this is the place that dragons go to die. I'm wondering if it was called that. They might not have brought it up, but I'm wondering if it's because Galakrond was the first to die there, and then other drakes subsequently came there to die. Because it's supposed to be a holy, like, as much of a holy site as you can for dragons. That's like where the bones of Sindragosa were. Actually, I don't think, no, the bones of Sindragosa, she didn't make it there, and that's why her soul was at unrest, essentially, and that's why Arthas was able to raise her. But I wonder, because I thought that how it went was that there was the holy site where the dragons went to die, and then there was the tower that was built. And I'm not sure why I have that sequence in my mind, but for some reason that's why I thought it was there. But I don't think the temple was built until much later. I don't know. It's kind of a weird temple, though. It kind of looks kind of keeperish now that I think about it.
Yeah, and you don't just get the temple, but then you also get that whole path of the Titans that leads out into the sea, where I guess that's the kind of thing we need to go back and look on, like, old Kalimdor. Where exactly did that, like, why did the Titans need a road that led up to this temple, you know, this dragon temple, and where did where else did it go? I mean, I think that's really the only landmark that Knaak notes is like, oh wait, this looks like where Galakrond, or actually there was the one part where they went to fight Galakrond and like, wait, this is the wrong place. He doesn't die here.
Yeah.
And then of course Galakrond kicks their butt. But, yeah, I think again, because it's been, I mean, this is pre-Sundering. So it's more than 10,000 years. And again, I need to go back to Chronicle to find out when exactly this is supposedly set, but it's so far in the past, it's hard to imagine there being many landmarks that would actually stand the test of time. But it's almost one of those things I wonder with like Titan architecture. Like, do the Titans, like you look at this stuff, or even like if you look on Argus, all the stuff that they had built on Argus, the Legion did, and like the craftsmanship that goes into it, like, I can't imagine that they even had like slave labor to build that. I just kind of feel like they just summoned this stuff from the earth. That like Wormrest Temple was just like they just went and they just brought it up from the earth, and it was just that well crafted. Or the Tomb of Sargeras, which was formerly like a Temple of Elune, like somebody just like raised that from the earth, and it was just that ornately crafted. Because I can't imagine anybody like, I can't imagine like somebody sitting there with like blueprints, like building this out and like, you know, sitting there chiseling all these different materials to get all these ornate sculptures and faces. Cause there's always so many faces in all the architecture, to get all that there, that it was just born that way, as it were.
Yeah, that's a good point. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Katie. I was going to say, it's so enshrined into dragon culture, clearly, you know, the way they talk about it. So, and you mentioned that, you know, all the dragons go there to die, and they're all apparently trying to face Galakrond, or at least they orientate themselves. So, yeah, you know, again, chicken and egg scenario. Which came first? Was it the sort of the almost religious, I guess, significance of the site, or the temple that clearly captures all of that?
They do address that a little bit too, in that they say they kind of hid Galakrond's full story, and that they, you know, like they say he's the father of dragons, and they even kind of say like, well, he is the father of dragons, like he was the event that caused us to become the aspects, caused us to become the dragons, that we then begat the rest of the, you know, the actual dragon flights. And so in that regard, he is the sort of the progenitor. But they've also kind of, they covered up the whole dark past, because I remember reading this, I'm like, none of this makes any sense. Like, this is not the story that we've been told, that like this, like, what's going on? And then once you kind of see how it all fits together, you're like, okay, I guess I can kind of buy it, because it's one of those things, and I think they do a fairly good job that, you know, it's a prequel story. Like, you know, like, the 5 aspects can't die. But they do a fairly good job of putting them in danger enough that you're like, well, what if they do? Like, what's the out gonna be? Like, how are they gonna make this all make sense at the end? And then it does all come together.
Yeah, they did specifically say that the reason they covered up Galakrond's true nature is they didn't want any other dragons to try and go down this path of power that ultimately turned out to be this great devastation. And I don't know if you guys had any other quick thoughts. I had a really interesting thought I wanted to bring up as well. It's kind of shifting topics, though, so...
Go for it.
All right, well, I thought it was interesting when they were describing the Proto-drakes as a shift in topic a little bit here, that they were all different colors. Because if you think about the aspects as we know them today, they're separated into 5 very specific color families. But in the book, they go on to talk about like orange Proto-drakes and white Proto-drakes, and not to be confused with like the corrupted ones, but they talk about like rainbows of colors of Proto-drakes. And I think it's interesting that today it's pretty much boiled down to just the 5 colors. And I mean, you do get like the purple Proto-dragon in game, so we know that there are technically other colors, but they're just like in dragons today. There really aren't any of the other colors. Like, we don't really have orange dragons. Like, the red has some variety, but like Ysera started out as a yellow female more so than green, which is interesting. And I don't know. I just thought it was interesting that the dragons, some of them have changed color over time, just as another footnote into dragon history.
One other thing, speaking of the dragons, I thought they did a good job was setting up the powers that the dragons would go on to have. Like, Nozdormu is constantly mentioned as always being on time.
Yes.
And, like, coming just in the nick of time. Like, they always kind of put time with him. And then there's the one part where Ysera, they mentioned she's one of the first proto-dragons to use a tool. And the tool she used was a vine to tie up one of the one of the undead dragons. And so again, it's like, well, of course, she's with nature, entangling roots. Like that's a core druid ability, and she's kind of using that even before she really has that. So I thought they did a good job of setting that. And also I think her ability was kind of like she had like a sleep breath weapon, basically.
It's like dream weapon, wasn't it?
Yeah, dream weapon. Norse Dormu had sand, which I thought was pretty cool. Because at first I'm like, what are you going to do breathing sand? And then you breathe it into the eyes and stuff. I was like, oh, that's actually rather smart. Like, that's a cool idea. So
it's coarse and irritating. Is that what it is?
And Neltharion just headbutted things very hard.
Yes.
Although he does have a stomp ability. He had like some sort of quaking ability where he could and he could like seismic wave shout at things, which was cool too. And I was like, oh, Earth Warder. Because I was trying to figure out what on earth his cool ability would be when they first got him. I was like, Earth, like, does he breathe magma? But the red dragons breathe fire, so what's he gonna do?
And I guess they had to do that, didn't they? They had to make their abilities chime with the aspects they were to become. I can't remember any other, because as you say, Katie, there were so many different aspects, and I can only imagine the reason that we don't have those is one. Obviously, this was written after they thought of it, but at the same time, I guess the law would be that with the aspects established, the others just died out or got amalgamated into the established aspects somehow. But it would have been cool to see. Talonixa, I can't. Hers is lightning.
Yeah, it's super cool. A lightning breath weapon.
Yeah, she was a really interesting character. The hot-headed, very equally stubborn and self-assured. I guess self-assumed leader of the Proto-dragons, and I thought her sort of delving into madness, effectively her descent into madness, was interesting because it ended on the right note. I really liked what they did with her, building up so convinced that she could beat Galakrond and almost single-handedly beat Galakrond at one point. I thought she was really nice. But as a Proto-dragon with a different ability, I guess it'd be nice to see some others. I can't remember if there were any others that stood out. I think there probably wasn't a chance.
Well, it's interesting because they talk about the dragons, and this is a part like where Nick was talking about where they just cut out of parts, but they were talking about how the Proto-drakes came together. It's like, okay, how do your families fight? Because each of the Proto-dragons is part of a different family. But it sounds like there are gray Proto-dragons in the black Proto-dragon family, like gray and black, and like they call Neltharion charcoal gray all the time. And so, it sounds like their families have very specific fighting styles, and they're unique to each of the families. It's weird that, Ysera, for example, was yellow, because I know that Ysera and Alexstrasza are sisters, but it's like, okay, but she becomes green later, there are green Proto-drakes, so that was a little... We won't get into that, but it sounds like each family has very unique fighting styles, but every family has, within each family there are unique breath weapons, and that bothered me because I want to know more. This is a really cool part into dragon lore that we've never really seen before. So, you can be... Talonixa, for example, was a gold dragon, so she was part of Norse Dormu's family, I think, just kind of based on how she was described. And so I was like, okay, well, they have lightning and sand. It's what other kind of unique breath weapons do we see from that family that we don't see anymore? I think all bronze dragons use sand for the most part for their breath weapon. So I was like, but this was cool. Where did this go? Where did this come from? And then we didn't get to find out about their fighting techniques. But that ultimately helped them defeat Galakrond to a large part because they coordinated their unique fighting styles, which was really cool. But again, would have loved to hear more about Proto-dragon fighting styles. I'm sad we didn't.
One other thing, again, to kind of piggyback off that is I think that's one of the classic Warcraft themes, is that everybody comes together, and together you can take down a much bigger opponent. I mean, they were basically five-manning Galakrond, as it were. But even then, though, one of the points with Talonixa is that they talk about how, she united all of the Proto-drakes, and, within them, they would, there were clashes within the Proto-drakes, but again, they all put aside their differences to come together, just like the Horde and the Alliance always do, to come together when there's a bigger threat. Once again, we see that where these, various factions come together because something's going to destroy the world again.
It's just the way when you're in the World of Warcraft, you just got to be prepared. we've got a few minutes. We'll start to wrap up here. But something that stuck in my head recently was that we did get to the end of it, but it was dragged out. Maybe that's the wrong word. It sounds a bit harsh, but it was brought up for longer than I thought it should have been. Was Alystrad's and Ysera's brother? Because that was a huge plot point. They find Kalecgos finds his dead body. They're upset, and then there's this long arc about is he actually undead? Did they find is the body somewhere? And when they have that scene in the cave where Sarah demonstrates her powers, I did think, well, actually, is this going to be him? I think there's a scene where Kalecgos wonders about it for a moment. But in a sense, I kind of got a bit frustrated that we didn't get to the bottom of that, because I thought it would have been good to explore some of that dynamic. What would their brother have been like, or how would they have dealt with potentially having to fight him? It could have been something interesting, where they're forced to re-kill their own brother. I don't know if you guys felt the same, or were there any other aspects of the story, without sounding too critical, where we start bashing on it for the last 10 minutes, were there any aspects of the story that you felt frustrated that weren't resolved properly, or perhaps were resolved in a different way than you would have liked?
Well, I felt like, yeah, you're right that they set up the Drowled stuff and then they never really paid that off. And other than just like Ysera's relentlessness, like, no, we need to talk to Galakrond, but they didn't really pay that off. The other thing too, I felt like Koros should have come back as an undead at some point, just to finally let Kalecgos just get one final punch in and just let his body shatter and he'd be done with it. But other than that, I don't know, I felt like maybe they could have. I felt like the way that they wound up explaining the artifact, they just kind of give you like 3 paragraphs where they're like, and this is what it was supposed to do, and Jaina was able to cleanse it, and let's move on. It felt very like this is the answer to that riddle, instead of, I think, letting it kind of just flow into the narrative a little bit more. That part felt rushed. And also, I guess, explain a little bit more about who Bunique was, because we're still left with questions on that.
Of course you want to know more about the Tauren. Just throwing it out there.
The Tonka to be technical.
Sure, the Tonka.
But most likely she was not a Tonka.
No, she wasn't. I just thought I'd take a little jab at you, the Tauren over there.
Fair enough.
Bunique, I think in particular, was a character, regardless of who she was and all that, perhaps deliberately left mysterious, but I still think, there could have been perhaps a bit more explored. All she seemed to serve as was a way to link Jaina to what Kalecgos was kind of going through. And I think after that, you didn't hear from her again after Jaina got fully involved. So that was about the extent of it. And as you say, given that she clearly has this big mysterious past, I think that would have been cool. Even if it was just a reference to the cloaked shadow, maybe it wasn't the shadow, maybe it was Bunique standing there. That might have been an interesting way.
Bunique shows up to give Jaina this rune, basically, like the image that she can then use to. She figures out how to use that later with the other artifacts and stuff. But the one thing about she describes it having a crescent star. Like, what's a crescent star? I know what a crescent moon is, and I know what a star is. What's a crescent star?
It's like a crescent moon plus a star? Is it a part of a star?
Maybe it's a crescent moon with a star inside. That actually makes sense.
Yeah.
Like a star with a crescent with it. Because, like, how... Yeah, I was trying to imagine the image, and I'm like, wait a minute, like, this... And I'm like, is it... Yeah, I guess that would make sense if it's the crescent. It's the moon with the crescent star in there.
Well, because I was thinking otherwise it could be like the crescent shape, and then like parts of the star go through the crescent shape. But I don't know, like, because I'm trying to think of like the Titan, what the Titan runes look like. I was like, oh, okay, that looks vaguely Titan-esque. Like, I could jam with that. I did like Bunique as a character, but I felt like they spent some like I don't want to say a weird amount of time developing her, but she's like, yes, I have come here to, like, hunt for my mate and, like, to retrieve a bone of Galakrond or something, whatever it was. But I'm like, that's an odd amount of, like, specific backstory. It's like, I have come here to hunt.
You've planned that backstory, haven't you?
Yeah,
it's like the story you get ready for the cops.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, yes, I've just told every adventurer that's walked through here exactly what I'm doing. Yeah, no, I think Bunique was good. I think you're right, though, about Alystrad's and Ysera's brother. Although I think his death was important to kind of make Ysera get very focused on him. Like, I think I'm trying to remember at what point this was, but she became more and more dreamy, where she was just kind of like less and less focused in the present. And I was like, oh, like we're starting to see her become the dreaming aspect a little bit there, where she just becomes less and less focused and based in current reality. I guess another cool thing that I noticed in the book is when you first read the book, you notice that the perspective of the aspects is kind of disjointed. Like, they think of themselves as individuals, but later in the book, Neltharion actually says the word I. And I was like, oh, this to me signaled a shift in how they're thinking, right? Like, at first it seems kind of more like not I do this thing, but like Kalecgos do this thing. Like Neltharion is like Neltharion and Kalecgos smart, others not smart. But then at one point later in the book, Neltharion says I do this, and I was like, oh, you are no longer referring to yourself in the third person. You're thinking yourself as an individual. And that was kind of a cool changing point in how they became more and more aware of themselves and other proto-drakes. And that was a really cool and I think really unique way to write the story, which is not a criticism, so I apologize. But there's just something to watch out for if you're actually reading or listening to the book.
I think that's a really good point. So we've got a couple of minutes left. I think we've been going on for about almost 90 minutes now, so it's probably a good time to wrap up. And there's clearly so much more we could talk about. I feel like we've covered an expanse. This really is a book you want to read. But I guess final thoughts on what we thought in general, or if there's a particular point you want to bring up again at the end, you feel free to. But Nick, I'll go to you first, just because you're the first one I looked at. What are your final reflections on Dawn of the Aspects?
The one final point I want to bring up is that when referring to Jaina, Knaak has one particular passage that she was biting back an epithet worthy of her naval father. I thought that was a very nice way of saying that she wanted to curse. Other than that, I mean, it's a good book. I mean, to really get into the proto-dragons and the aspects, and they were much more important characters, I think, in Cataclysm, and I think this sets up sort of where they're heading after Cataclysm, at least that they're still going to be players in the world. We do see Kalac show up. We know that they're somewhat involved a little bit with Chromie, as far as her being out at the at Wormrest Temple. I mean, we saw Ysera show up in Val'sharah. So these are characters that are still appearing in the game, going forward, and will have a role. I personally would like to see the dragon aspects come back. I would like to see, Kalac and Alexstrasza, and then whoever else they might pick. I guess Wrathion for the black dragons, and see them sort of charged and refocused, and maybe not necessarily with such a purpose as stopping the Hour of Twilight, but I'd still like to see them be major characters. And I know that's something that Ian has said, that it's like, what is World of Warcraft without dragons? Like it's kind of you're taking something away from the world when you minimize their importance. So presumably we'll see them come back more, and I think this is an important chapter in dragon history.
Awesome. Katie?
I'd have to agree with Nick. I think that this book is really important to understand where the aspects have come from. So I know a lot of people enjoy the aspects as they are in the game now, but if people are kind of asking themselves like, whoa, what were the dragons like before, or like what the heck are proto-dragons, this is a great book that kind of links the two and bridges dragon history a little bit more. Unfortunately, it doesn't give us any history after they become the aspects, but I think it answers a lot of questions about how they originally saw each other and how they kind of became the close-knit family, and why they're so, I don't know, the way the aspects are the way they are, and like why the death of Neltharion affected all of them in different ways, and Kalecgos as well. And I think it's worth a read. It was an interesting book to go through because, like, as we were talking about, the perspectives change a lot, but it is actually, it's a good book for what it is, and I enjoyed it, and I would encourage people to go read it because, again, dragons are awesome, and I'm guessing we're going to start seeing more of them, especially because I think Ian is a fan of dragons. So, got my fingers crossed. And I hope that we can help them with their reproduction issues, so there will be more dragons in the world, because I was horribly upset when they're like, yeah, there'll be no more dragons, they're all going to die. I was like, don't you dare do that to me. Wiping back tears.
if they all die, then where are the mounts going to come from?
Right.
That's the question, isn't it? We need them to breed so that we can use them as mounts.
I
think
mean,
yeah.
Isn't that literally the logic that the orcs had in Warcraft 2?
That is Warlord. Is it Zayla? I can't remember who it is, but yeah, basically,
Yeah.
I think enslavement is the option. But
That's,
okay, and I was going to throw out something cool just for a little Easter egg for people out there. If you do the raid of the Mists of Pandaria, Galakrond is the last of the brood of Galakrond. So now you know who Galakrond is. Just throwing it out there when you go and run through Pandaria for Transmog. Where you go and punch Galakrond, you're like, oh, Galakrond, that jerk. I understand. Things are coming together now. So
slightly smaller in size,
Just
so slightly.
But you can have the mount that's like one of the last of the brood of Galakrond. So you're like, cool, I'm riding on one of Galakrond's last descendants. That brbrings up a whole world of questions that I don't think we can answer.
Or is it the last descendant? Who knows?
Dun, dun, dun.
I mean, I think to throw Mighty said, I chime perfectly with what you guys have said. I think it's a really good story to explore something which, quite frankly, you're not going to see in any other way. You can't really do a cabin to time on this thing. You can't really do a piece of lore that a keeper speaks. It's great to see as you say, the background to perhaps one of the biggest characters that never quite was with Galakrond. Clearly a huge part of the lore that hasn't really had a chance to be explored because he's dead. And at the same time, I think exploring the aspects and I think this is kind of where a lot of the power of the book comes from, characters that were perhaps taken for granted in terms of what their purpose was. And I think Richard A. Knaak does a really good job of showing that, I think maybe they took their purpose for granted and giving the reins of power or responsibility to others has repercussions, even for dragons and beings of that scale. Whether what role they'll play, is clearly we're starting to explore new worlds and things like that play in. I don't know, but certainly given how messed up BFA is going to be, they might regret perhaps giving up their aspect powers. They might have wanted to save some smiting for us, but there we go. So it sounds like we all recommend this book. So it's a really good one, and heck, there's a bit of romance in there as well. Not quite 50 Shades level, but it does. I don't know. There is one scene where she starts to talk about how she could convince Kalecgos to help her out, and I did read that in a really weird way, but it was late at night. Hey, but yeah. So if you want to check it out, you can buy it at all good bookstores, I guess, which probably means you're going to go to Amazon and download it. And there's also an audiobook which I probably would recommend. If you're, scared of paper or something like that, maybe you want digital stuff. But that's about it, really. So, first episode, I want to say huge thanks, Nick, Katie, to you guys for joining me on this little escapade. We're going to refine these and, just keep talking what we talk about as we go on. I guess the next book is probably going to be Before the Storm, maybe. It's probably worth doing that. It depends on how quickly we can read Before the Storm. But that's 3 weeks away, I think, from the time of writing.
Probably binge read the whole thing in one sitting.
Yeah, possibly. We'll give ourselves a few weeks to read it, and then maybe we'll come back in about 5 weeks or so and give you guys, because that's going to be an interesting one. And some of the stuff coming out for that, it changes a lot. It's kind of as world-shattering as Galakrond was. So we'll check that out. But again, I want to say thanks, Nick and Katie. Guys, where can they check out you and your podcast if they want to follow you guys with what else you do?
Well, we're on the Torn and the Goblin over on mashthosebuttons.com. So that's at Torn Goblin on Twitter, and we're available on all podcatchers and platforms. I think you can find us on most of them, like iTunes and whatnot. I'm at WookieBH on Twitter, and Katie, where can people find you?
At Hyrule Master 77, and also on the Three Goblins podcast, also on Twitter. So, but lore-wise, Torn the Goblin.
Yeah, these guys are a lot better at the lore than I am, hence why I've chosen them to go on this adventure with. If you're interested, you can obviously find me at Britzza_EG and Geeks of Azeroth. Well, this would all be on the Geeks of Azeroth stuff, so if you found this, you know who we are probably anyways. But again, want to say thanks to everyone for tuning in. Thanks for listening if you're listening via the podcast apps, wherever they are, and join us next time for checking out probably one of the most anticipated Warcraft novels for a long time, that being Before the Storm. So until then, enjoy reading, and we'll see you on the next show.
Take care, everybody.
See you guys.